Hey there, curious minds. Welcome to study the U.S. history. Today, I'm starting the first chapter and let's dive into the untold history of the Americas before Europeans set foot on this land. Imagine a vast landscape where hundreds of different languages were spoken and diverse societies thrived. That's right. North and South America were bustling long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Most inhabitants were descendants of hunters and fishers who crossed the Bering Strait via a land bridge between 15,000 and 60,000 years ago. Yes, that's a huge range, and archaeologists are still debating the exact dates. Some others might have even arrived by sea from Asia or Pacific Islands. Around 14,000 years ago, glaciers started melting, submerging that land bridge and separating the Western Hemisphere from Asia. But history here didn't start with the Europeans. The New World was ancient for its native residents. People spread across the Americas, reaching the tip of South America about 11,000 years ago. As the climate warmed, they faced a major food crisis, with the extinction of mammoths and giant bison. Around 9,000 years ago, agriculture started flourishing in present-day Mexico and the Andes. Around the same time, it was emerging in the Near East. This made settled civilizations possible. Across the Americas, maize, squash, and beans became agricultural staples. However, unlike in the Old World, the absence of livestock limited farming practices. No plowing fields or natural fertilizers here. So, next time you think about the Americas, remember it was a land of rich and diverse civilizations long before Europeans arrived.
When Europeans arrived, North and South America contained cities, roads, irrigation systems, extensive trade networks, and large structures such as pyramid temples, whose beauty still inspires wonder. With a population close to 250,000, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico, was one of the world's largest cities. Its great temple, splendid royal palace, and a central market comparable to that of European capitals made the city seem like an enchanted vision, according to one of the first Europeans to encounter it. Farther south lay the Inca Kingdom, centered in modern-day Peru. Its population of perhaps 12 million was linked by a complex system of roads and bridges that extended 2,000 miles along the Andes mountain chain. Europeans encountered a wide variety of native peoples within the present borders of the United States. Indian civilizations in North America had not developed the scale, grandeur, or centralized organization of the Aztec and Inca societies to their south. North American Indians lacked the technologies Europeans had mastered, such as metal tools and machines, gunpowder, and the scientific knowledge necessary for long-distance navigation. Their backwardness became a central justification for European conquest. But Indian societies had perfected techniques of farming, hunting, and fishing, developed structures of political power and religious belief, and engaged in far-reaching networks of trade and communication. Remarkable physical remains still exist from some of the early civilizations in North America. Around 3,500 years ago, before Egyptians built the pyramids, Native Americans constructed a large community centered on a series of giant semicircular mounds on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River in present-day Louisiana. Known today as Poverty Point, it was a commercial and governmental center, whose residents established trade routes throughout the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. Archaeologists have found their copper from present-day Minnesota and Canada, and flint mined in Indiana. More than 1,000 years before Columbus sailed, Indians of the Ohio River Valley, called mound builders by 18th century settlers who encountered the large earthen burial mounds they created, traded across half the continent. After their decline, another culture flourished in the Mississippi River Valley, centered on the city of Cahokia near present-day St. Louis, a fortified community with between 10,000 and 30,000 inhabitants in the year 1200. Its residents, too, built giant mounds, the largest of which stood 100 feet high and was topped by a temple. Little is known of Cahokia's political and economic structure, but it stood as the largest settled community in what is now the United States, until surpassed in population by New York and Philadelphia around 1800. The remains can still be visited today. I'm sure you've heard the news about ancient civilizations, but have you met the architectural geniuses of the desert? Meet the Pueblo Indians. In the arid lands of present-day Arizona, the Hopi and Zuni, ancestors of the Pueblo Indians, crafted thriving communities over 3,000 years ago, Between 900 and 1200 AD, they built planned towns with multi-family dwellings, some standing 5 stories tall with over 600 rooms. They didn't just survive, they thrived, constructing dams and canals to harness precious water, and trading as far as central Mexico and the Mississippi Valley. After a major drought, these resilient people adapted, moving south and east to perfect desert farming techniques and continue their legacy. The Spanish called them Pueblo Indians, but we call them ingenious architects of the desert.
In eastern North America, hundreds of tribes inhabited towns and villages scattered from the Gulf of Mexico to present-day Canada. They lived on corn, squash, and beans, supplemented by fishing and hunting deer, turkeys, and other animals. Indian trade routes crisscrossed the eastern part of the continent. Tribes frequently warred with one another to obtain goods, seize captives, or take revenge for the killing of relatives. They conducted diplomacy and made peace. Little in the way of centralized authority existed until, in the 15th century, various leagues or confederations emerged in an effort to bring order to local regions. In the southeast, the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw each united dozens of towns in loose alliances. In present-day New York and Pennsylvania, 5 Iroquois peoples, the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Onondaga, formed a great league of peace, bringing a period of stability to the area. Each year a great council with representatives from the 5 groupings met to coordinate dealings with outsiders. The most striking feature of Native American society at the time Europeans arrived was its sheer diversity. Each group had its own political system and set of religious beliefs, and North America was home to literally hundreds of mutually unintelligible languages. Indians had no sense of America as a continent or hemisphere. They did not think of themselves as a single people, an idea invented by Europeans and only many years later adopted by Indians themselves. When Europeans first arrived, many Indians saw them as simply one group among many. Their first thought was how to use the newcomers to enhance their standing in relation to other native peoples, rather than to unite against them. The sharp dichotomy between Indians and white persons did not emerge until later in the colonial era. Nonetheless, the diverse Indian societies of North America did share certain common characteristics. Their lives were steeped in religious ceremonies often directly related to farming and hunting. Spiritual power, they believed, suffused the world, and sacred spirits could be found in all kinds of living and inanimate things, animals, plants, trees, water, and wind, an idea known as animism. Through religious ceremonies, they aimed to harness the aid of powerful supernatural forces to serve the interests of man. In some tribes, hunters performed rituals to placate the spirits of animals they had killed. Other religious ceremonies sought to engage the spiritual power of nature to secure abundant crops or fend off evil spirits. Indian villages also held elaborate religious rites, participation in which helped to define the boundaries of community membership. In all Indian societies, those who seemed to possess special abilities to invoke supernatural powers, shamans, medicine men, and other religious leaders, held positions of respect and authority. Indian religion did not pose a sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural, or secular and religious activities. In some respects, however, Indian religion was not that different from popular spiritual beliefs in Europe. Most Indians held that a single creator stood atop the spiritual hierarchy. Nonetheless, nearly all Europeans arriving in the New World quickly concluded that Indians were in dire need of being converted to a true Christian faith. Numerous land systems existed among Native Americans. Generally, however, village leaders assigned plots of land to individual families to use for a season or more, and tribes claimed specific areas for hunting. Unclaimed land remained free for anyone to use. Families owned the right to use land, but they did not own the land itself. Indians saw land, the basis of economic life for both hunting and farming societies, as a common resource, not an economic commodity. In the 19th century, the Indian leader Black Hawk would explain why, in his view, land could not be bought and sold. The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon, and cultivate as far as necessary for their subsistence. And so long as they occupy and cultivate it, they have a right to the soil. Few, if any, Indian societies were familiar with the idea of a fenced-off piece of land belonging forever to a single individual or family. There was no market in real estate before the coming of Europeans. Nor were Indians devoted to the accumulation of wealth and material goods, especially east of the Mississippi River, where villages moved every few years when soil or game became depleted. Acquiring numerous possessions made little sense. However, status certainly mattered in Indian societies. Tribal leaders tended to come from a small number of families, and chiefs lived more splendidly than average members of society, but their reputation often rested on their willingness to share goods with others rather than hoarding them for themselves. A few Indian societies had rigid social distinctions. Among the Natchez, descendants of the mound-building Mississippian culture, a chief, or great son, occupied the top of the social order, with nobles or lesser sons below him, and below them, the common people. In general, however, wealth mattered far less in Indian society than in European society at the time. Generosity was among the most valued social qualities, and gift-giving was essential to Indian society. Trade, for example, meant more than a commercial transaction. It was accompanied by elaborate ceremonies of gift exchange. Although Indians had no experience of the wealth enjoyed at the top of European society, under normal circumstances, no one in Indian societies went hungry or experienced the extreme inequalities of Europe. There are no beggars among them, reported the English colonial leader Roger Williams of New England's Indians.
The system of gender relations in most Indian societies also differed markedly from that of Europe. Membership in a family defined women's lives, but they openly engaged in premarital sexual relations and could even choose to divorce their husbands. Most, although not all, Indian societies were matrilineal, that is, centered on clans or kinship groups in which children became members of the mother's family, not the father's. Tribal leaders were almost always men, but women played an important role in certain religious ceremonies, and female elders often helped to select male village leaders and took part in tribal meetings. Under English law, a married man controlled the family's property, and a wife had no independent legal identity. In contrast, Indian women owned dwellings and tools, and a husband generally moved to live with the family of his wife. Contributions and responsibilities in Indian societies were deeply intertwined with gender roles, reflecting the unique ways in which both men and women upheld their communities. In Indian societies, men contributed to the community's well-being and demonstrated their masculinity by success in hunting, or, in the Pacific Northwest, by catching fish with nets and harpoons. Because men were frequently away on the hunt, women took responsibility not only for household duties, but for most agricultural work as well. Among the Pueblo of the Southwest, however, where there was less hunting than in the East, men were the primary cultivators.
Welcome to our exploration of early European views of Native Americans. This journey will uncover the complex and often contradictory perspectives held by European settlers as they encountered the indigenous peoples of North America. Let's dive in and see how these early interactions shaped the history and perceptions that followed. Europeans tended to view Indians in extreme terms. They were regarded either as noble savages, gentle, friendly, and superior in some ways to Europeans, or as uncivilized barbarians. Giovanni da Verrazzano, a Florentine navigator who sailed up and down the eastern coast of North America in 1524, described Indians he encountered as beautiful of stature and build. Over time, however, negative images of Indians came to overshadow positive ones. Religion and land use were central to the European critique of Native American life. Europeans often misunderstood or dismissed the spiritual practices of the indigenous peoples, viewing them through a lens of their own religious beliefs and cultural norms. They saw the communal and sustainable land use practices of Native Americans as primitive, failing to recognize the sophisticated environmental stewardship at play. These misunderstandings fueled a narrative that justified the European colonization and exploitation of the land. Early European descriptions of North American Indians as barbaric centered on three areas: religion, land use, and gender relations. Whatever their country of origin, European newcomers concluded that Indians lacked genuine religion, or in fact worshipped the devil. Their shamans and herb healers were called witch doctors, their numerous ceremonies and rituals at best a form of superstition, their belief in a world alive with spiritual power, a worship of false gods. Christianity presented no obstacle to the commercial use of the land and indeed in some ways encouraged it, since true religion was thought to promote the progress of civilization. Whereas the Indians saw nature as a world of spirits and souls, the Europeans viewed it as a collection of potential commodities, a source of economic opportunity. The concept of land ownership was fundamentally different between Europeans and Native Americans. Europeans believed in individual ownership and the right to buy, sell, and exploit land for personal gain. Native Americans, on the other hand, saw land as a communal resource, something to be shared and respected by the entire community. This stark contrast led to numerous conflicts and misunderstandings, as each side struggled to comprehend the other's viewpoint. Europeans invoked the Indians' distinctive pattern of land use and ideas about property to answer the awkward question raised by a British minister at an early stage of England's colonization. By what right or warrant can we enter into the land of these savages, take away their rightful inheritance from them, and plant ourselves in their places? While the Spanish claimed title to land in America by right of conquest and papal authority, the English, French, and Dutch came to rely on the idea that Indians had not actually used the land, and thus had no claim to it. Despite the Indians' highly developed agriculture and well-established towns, Europeans frequently described them as nomads without settled communities. The land was thus deemed to be a vacant wilderness ready to be claimed by newcomers who would cultivate and improve it. European settlers believed that mixing one's labor with the earth, which Indians supposedly had failed to do, gave one title to the soil. In many Native American societies, gender roles were quite distinct yet complementary. Women were often responsible for agriculture, gathering, and maintaining the home, while men typically took on roles such as hunting, fishing, and warfare. Despite these divisions, both genders held significant power and influence within their communities. This balance of responsibilities ensured that both men and women were seen as vital to the survival and prosperity of their people. In the Indians' gender division of labor and matrilineal family structures, Europeans saw weak men and mistreated women. Hunting and fishing, the primary occupations of Indian men, were considered leisure activities in much of Europe, not real work. Because Indian women worked in the fields, Europeans often described them as lacking freedom. They were not much better than slaves, in the words of one English commentator. Europeans considered Indian men unmanly, too weak to exercise authority within their families and restrain their wives' open sexuality, and so lazy that they forced their wives to do most of the productive labor. Throughout North America, Europeans promoted the ideas that women should confine themselves to household work and that men ought to exercise greater authority within their families. Europeans insisted that by subduing the Indians they were actually bringing them freedom. The freedom of true religion, private property, and the liberation of both men and women from uncivilized and unchristian gender roles.